let's take a closer look at the digestive organs that are found in mammals. Essentially, we'll follow the path that food takes through the human alimentary canal. Now, other types of mammals do have some special modifications depending upon their diet. But humans and other mammals also have a number of primary digestive organs in common. So the digestive system includes both the body cavity, known as the alimentary canal, that passageway that travels one way from the mouth to the anus, keeping the partially digested food separate from any new food that's eaten later. This is really a convenient adaptation for the animal. If an animal encounters new fresh food, it doesn't have to let the digestion of old food interfere with the ingestion of new food, the way that a gastrovascular cavity with only one opening would limit other types of animals. The digestive system also includes any glands connected to the alimentary canal, known as accessory glands, that manufacture and secrete digestive juices through ducts, which are kind of like tubes, into the alimentary canal. And these digestive juices are involved in the chemical portion of the digestive process. These accessory glands include the salivary glands, the pancreas, the liver, and the gallbladder. As food moves through the alimentary canal, it's pushed in the correct direction by peristalsis. These are rhythmic, involuntary contractions of muscles on the wall of the alimentary canal. And involuntary means that you don't even have to think about it. The body just pushes the food when the food is there. The body responds to the presence of food by pushing it in the correct direction, regardless of any conscious effort. Interestingly, peristalsis is a very strong force, and it has a very strong and accurate sense of direction. In fact, if you were to eat food while standing on your head, the food would still reach your stomach through peristalsis. As the food moves between specific compartments in the digestive system, special muscles called sphincters regulate the movement of material between the compartments. So these sphincters can close off one compartment and keep new food from entering that compartment until the next step of the digestive process can occur, and that food has been passed on to the next organ of the digestive system. They can also control the elimination of wastes. So you could think of the sphincters as sort of like traffic lights, preventing the food at different stages of digestion from crashing into food that's at a different step in the digestive process. So recall that the first stage of digestion is mechanical. That's the crushing or grinding of food. In mammals, this mechanical digestion takes place in the oral cavity, and the specialized teeth of mammals allow the food to be chewed and crushed into very small particles. Once the food has been chewed, salivary glands at the back of the throat and the bottom of the mouth secrete saliva, which has chemicals for breaking down food into smaller pieces. The smaller the particles of food, the more surface area there is for the saliva to make contact and be well mixed throughout the food. One of the primary chemicals inside of saliva is called salivary amylase. That's an enzyme that initiates the breakdown of carbohydrates, including the polymers that contain glucose, into smaller pieces. Although the saliva may not break down every sugar into a monosaccharide, typically it breaks the sugars down into much shorter chains. Saliva also contains mucus. Mucus is a slippery or viscous mixture of water, salts, cells, and glycoproteins. Mucus is involved not only in the chemical digestion of food, but in helping it slip easily down the throat. Without mucus, we'd be a lot more likely to choke on our food. The coordination between muscles in the throat and the esophagus also prevents choking. The esophagus, which is a long tube that extends from the throat down to the stomach, is the passageway that food travels from the mouth, and peristalsis is that squeezing action of the muscles that scoots the food and, with the assistance of mucus, allows it to glide smoothly down to the stomach. The structure of the esophagus varies a lot among species. Humans have kind of a nifty adaptation at the back of their esophagus. They have a flap called the epiglottis, which covers the entry to the lungs during swallowing. And that prevents the entry of food into the lungs, which would be extremely dangerous. The stomach is a large storage compartment with the ability to stretch to accommodate very large amounts of food. Gastric juices, also known as stomach acids, are secreted in the stomach. The chemical action of these acids breaks the food down into much simpler chemicals, and a mixture of food and these digestive acids is called chyme. While the primary action of the stomach in digestion is chemical, the stomach can also squeeze the gastric juices and the food together in a form of mechanical digestion that creates a pasty substance called chyme. Notice that sphincters control the entry of food from the esophagus to the stomach and from the stomach to the next digestive compartment. The stomach has some extremely complex adaptations that allow it to do its job very well. There are holes in the surface of the stomach known as gastric pits, and these folds contain cells that secrete enzymes needed to break down food. Hydrochloric acid is a substance in the body with one of the lowest pHs. Large amounts of hydrochloric acids secreted by cells in these gastric pits allow the pH of the stomach to occasionally drop as low as a pH of about 1.5. If you were to touch a substance with a pH that low, it could be very dangerous. So fortunately, the stomach also has a number of cells that secrete protective mucus that help to provide a buffer between the walls of the stomach and this dangerous acid. Another important enzyme found in the stomach is known as pepsin. Pepsin is converted back and forth between two different forms, pepsin and pepsinogen. Like hydrochloric acid, pepsinogen is secreted by cells found in the gastric pit of the folds in the stomach. Hydrochloric acid then causes changes in the pH of the stomach. And at low pHs, pepsinogen is converted to its active form, pepsin. In its active form, pepsin is involved in breaking down proteins. The activity of pepsin stimulates the production of more pepsinogen, starting a chain reaction that allows digestion to be very efficient. When the chyme leaves the stomach and travels to the small intestine, the pH of the stomach will be elevated. Pepsin is no longer converted to pepsinogen, and the production of pepsinogen stops. So we can see that the digestive system has some very efficient mechanisms for producing what it needs when it needs, and not wasting energy on the production of enzymes that aren't currently being used. The surface of the stomach also has some larger, deeper folds. The gastric pits are smaller indentations found on the tissue that makes up these folds. The folds have a very important function. They allow the organism to consume a very large meal, because they allow the stomach to stretch to the size that it needs to be in order to consume that large meal. In effect, these folds work kind of like an accordion, allowing the stomach to expand. Before we move on from the stomach to the next compartment of the alimentary canal, let's talk a little bit about the stresses that the stomach faces. Those gastric juices, hydrochloric acid and pepsin mixed together, provide a very acidic and very harsh environment. On average, the pH of that mixture is about 2, although it can fluctuate very widely. I've already mentioned that the mucus provides a protective layer that helps prevent damage from the acid. Another defense that the stomach has against the acid is the very rapid regeneration of new cells in the epithelial layer that forms the stomach lining. On average, these cells are replaced about once every 3 days. That's very fast for any portion of the human body. A common stomach problem is the presence of ulcers. These are lesions or sores in the stomach lining. At one point in time, gastric ulcers were thought to be caused primarily by stress and by certain types of diets. A very bold scientist got the idea that instead, gastric ulcers were caused by a bacterium. And he thought that he'd isolated the bacterium known as Helicobacter pylori, or commonly abbreviated H. pylori. The scientist then performed an experiment on himself. I wouldn't recommend that any of us ever try this, but he consumed the bacteria and gave himself a gastric ulcer. It's now fairly well accepted that H. pylori causes gastric ulcers. Although many people have H. pylori in their stomach, some of them get ulcers and some do not. So we're still figuring out how different factors interact with the presence of the bacteria to cause the ulcers. But it certainly is known that the bacteria play a much greater role than the acid in forming the ulcers. Since the stomach has such very good defenses already lined up to protect itself against the acids. Okay, so the next organ that chyme, that mushed up food and digestive juice mixture, encounters is the small intestine. The small intestine is the longest section of the alimentary canal. It's called the small intestine because of its smaller or narrower diameter when compared with the large intestine. You can see the small intestine here folded up in the abdomen. If you were to stretch out a human small intestine, it would be over 20 feet long. We can compare its size here with that of the large intestine, which is much thicker and has these distinct segments. Now, the mouth has already played an important role in breaking down some of the larger carbohydrates into smaller molecules like disaccharides. The stomach has played an important role in breaking down the proteins. It's primarily the proteins that need that very acidic environment in order to be broken down into smaller groups of amino acids. However, when the food reaches the small intestine, there's still a lot of chemical digestion that has to occur. And the small intestine has the most important role in both digesting the food or breaking it down into smaller components, as well as in absorption. Okay, so during absorption, these molecules that have already been digested cross over the cell membrane and go into the tissues of the body, where they can then be used or transported to other regions of the body, where they're either used or stored up for later use. The small intestine can be divided into 3 other regions. The duodenum is the first region that food encounters, and it's followed by the jejunum and the ileum. So entrance of chyme from the stomach into the duodenum, the first portion of the small intestine, is regulated by a sphincter. Okay, and that sphincter has a special name, the pyloric sphincter. You can think of the sphincter as a ring-shaped muscle that squeezes tightly shut when it wants to block travel of materials, and it relaxes and opens when it wants to allow the materials to pass. The duodenum has a greater role in chemical digestion and a more minor role in absorption. When the food travels through the small intestine to the jejunum and the ileum, most of the chemical digestion is done, and these later regions are more intensely involved in absorbing the nutrients from the food. Because the chyme from the stomach is so acidic, it needs to be neutralized very quickly, which means the pH would need to be raised. It needs to be neutralized very quickly to avoid damaging the small intestine. Enzymes from these accessory glands, including the pancreas, the liver, and the gallbladder, mix with the acidic chyme to raise the pH and get the pH much closer to neutral. Enzymes secreted along the intestinal wall also aid in this process. Pancreatic enzymes are rich in an alkaline solution known as bicarbonate that plays an important role in neutralizing the acidic chyme from the stomach. The pancreas also produces enzymes which further assist in breaking down proteins. Remember that pepsin has already begun to break down proteins in the stomach. Additional enzymes called trypsin and chymotrypsin, produced by the pancreas, break these pieces of proteins into smaller and smaller pieces. These enzymes are also helpful in breaking down fats and carbohydrates. Most of the carbohydrates leave the mouth as disaccharides and slightly longer chains that might consist of 3 or 4 monosaccharides. Remember that carbohydrates need to be broken down into monosaccharides, and proteins need to be broken down into individual amino acids before absorption can take place. Fats also need to be broken down further into smaller pieces so that they can be effectively absorbed. The liver is the largest gland in the body. It produces an enzyme known as bile that aids in the digestion and the absorption of fats. So while the liver produces bile, it empties the bile into a gallbladder for temporary storage. The gallbladder acts sort of like a little bulb, and it squeezes out the bile as it's needed in the digestive system. The liver also has an important role in breaking down red blood cells that are no longer functioning properly. Essentially, the liver recycles the parts found in the blood cells and makes them available to the body to be used later in manufacturing other cells. The liver also breaks down a number of toxins from the body, including alcohol. Diseases of the liver can be very deadly and can contribute to a condition called jaundice that's evident in a patient as yellow skin. Liver diseases can be very serious, and a damaged liver can actually kill a person. So in addition to the enzymes produced in the pancreas and the liver, the epithelial cells of the duodenum actually produce additional digestive enzymes. So these large number of enzymes working together, as more mechanical digestion occurs, while peristalsis moves the chyme down the stomach and mixes those digestive juices along into the chyme, the action of so many enzymes and so much mechanical work means that the majority of digestion occurs in the duodenum. Okay, remember that it's primarily carbohydrates that are broken down in the mouth, and proteins that are primarily broken down in the stomach. The small intestine breaks down both proteins and carbohydrates, as well as fats. So essentially, the duodenum is continuing the job that the salivary amylase started in the mouth, continuing the job that the pepsin began in the stomach, and it's starting work on the fats. As the chyme travels down the small intestine and reaches the jejunum and the ileum, digestion is nearly complete, and absorption begins. The small intestine is extremely well designed for absorption. Okay, notice these pits and folds that are found in the surface of the small intestine. So these grooves allow additional surface area for absorption. And we already have a lot because the small intestine is about 20 feet long in a human. Another feature that increases the surface area for absorption, which includes all of the surface area that the food can come into contact with, is the presence of these microvilli. These are extensions. These are the extensions of the cell that are finger-like and are also known as the brush border. Since the chyme can travel in between these finger-like extensions, the presence of this brush border multiplies the surface area available for digestion several times over. Another important feature of the small intestine that makes nutrient absorption very effective is the fact that so many blood vessels surround the small intestine. After nutrients pass through these epithelial cells where absorption begins, they can then be absorbed into the bloodstream. And the bloodstream is responsible for transporting these nutrients around the body to places that they can either be used or stored for later. So the geometry of the small intestines, due to those villi, which are the larger grooves on the inside of the small intestine, and then those tiny finger-like projections, the microvilli, that form that brush border along the surface of epithelial cells, interacts with the long length of the small intestine for a truly amazing surface area for absorption. All of these tiny structures put together mean that a surface area of about 200 to 300 square meters is available for absorption in an adult human. That's about the size of a tennis court. Can you believe that all of that fits within your digestive system? So transportation of nutrients across those epithelial cells occurs primarily along that brush border. In some cases it's active, and in other cases it's passive, depending upon the type of the nutrient. So let's look up close at one of the epithelial cells that forms that brush border on the inner surface of the small intestine. The lumen of the small intestine is part of the alimentary canal. So that's the hollow cavity through which the chyme is moving. Monosaccharides, the small building blocks of sugar, pass easily across the cell membrane and into the bloodstream. If you were to eat some sugar, it would take only about an hour for your blood sugar to rise, because those sugars are so small and so easily transferred into the bloodstream. The absorption of fats, on the other hand, is a little bit more complicated. Keep in mind that fats have these nonpolar fatty acid tails, and their nonpolar nature means that they repel water. So we have fatty acids, monoglycerides, which are a single fatty acid with a polar end, and the most common form of fat consumed in the human diet is a triglyceride. It has the polar end as well as 3 fatty acid tails. These triglycerides need to be broken down into these smaller components before they can cross the membrane of the brush border. Once inside the cell, they're reassembled into triglycerides. And then, due to their nonpolar nature, they cluster together and form these balls called chylomicrons. So remember that a cell is mostly water. As these fatty acid chains repel water, they clump together and form this ball. The ball, called a chylomicron, is much too large to pass from the inside of the cell directly into blood vessels. So instead, it enters these larger passageways that are very similar to trapdoors. These holes are called lacteals, and they're openings to the lymphatic system. The lymphatic system also plays a role in fighting infections, but it has a mechanism for delivering these fat molecules to the bloodstream in an area in your neck where a larger opening occurs for exchange between the lymphatic system and the circulatory system. So we've seen how digestion continues in the duodenum, the first part of the small intestine, and how absorption of nutrients occurs in the later part of the small intestine. After leaving the small intestine, the remainder of the food, all of the nutrients that haven't yet been absorbed, enter the large intestine. And we can easily identify the large intestine because of its thicker diameter and its lumpier or segmented shape. The cecum, the colon, and the appendix are all portions of the large intestine. And the cecum is the portion that the undigested food enters first. The cecum has a lot of important bacteria in it that are involved in the fermentation of plant material, and they break down the tougher and harder to digest carbohydrates. An extension of the cecum is known as the appendix. It provides ideal conditions for growing certain types of bacteria. And it also plays a minor role in the immune system. Commonly, the appendix gets infected or inflamed and sometimes has to be removed. Unfortunately, people whose appendix have been removed are slightly more prone to other future infections and diseases. But since this is a minor effect, you really shouldn't sweat it if you've lost your appendix. So in addition to breaking down some of the tough material that can't be digested in the small intestine, a major function of the colon is to absorb water that enters the alimentary canal. About 90% of the water that you eat or drink is reabsorbed in the colon. This water can then be used in cells, or it can be diverted through the bloodstream to the excretory system, where it's used to safely dilute out urea and dispose of toxins from the excretory system. Now, I can't really stress enough how important the presence of some bacteria are in the colon. Okay, remember that the human body has about 10 times as many bacteria in it as it has human body cells. These bacteria not only help to break down some of the tougher material to digest, but they actually perform some chemical reactions that produce some types of vitamins that can't be obtained from the diet. So if you were to eliminate all of the bacteria from your digestive system, you would actually be deficient in certain types of vitamins. In fact, many people experience digestive problems or vitamin deficiencies after taking antibiotics to cure infections. While the antibiotics may clear up the bacteria that are causing the disease, they also often kill the beneficial bacteria that we need in our digestive system. So once the digestive system has done everything it can to absorb all of the nutrients from the food it's consumed, some material is left over. This material, along with bacteria, is excreted from the body through a product that we know as feces. Feces can be stored in the rectum temporarily. That's the endmost part of the large intestine, until the muscle at the opening of the large intestine, called the anus, is ready to push it out. Just like the travel of food between the esophagus and the stomach and the small and large intestines is controlled by a sphincter, there are two sphincters on the rectum that control the expulsion of feces.